Hello and welcome everyone to the Her Drive podcast. This is the show where we talk to fantastic women who have utilized many arduous experiences in their lives most of the time to dive into ways to give back to the community around them. And I would like to introduce you all to today's guest. Her name is Laura Walton. She is the founder of Love Lou, which is an online grief coaching program for young women who are between the ages of 20 and 40, who have suddenly lost their partner to death. Laura is a clinic coach, after loss professional, and end of life coach, a licensed marriage family therapist, clinical supervisor, and a personal professional grief expert. We've never had anyone like Laura on Her Drive before, and I am very honored, Laura, to have you. Welcome to Her Drive.
Oh, well, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's interesting that we are recording this episode right now around the holidays, and this will air shortly after the holidays. But this seems to be a really tough time for people, and I've noticed in my circles there's a lot of grief going around, not necessarily death, so to speak, for everyone, but just grief in general. So I'm curious what it is about grief that really was appealing to you to work with it.
I sometimes joke that I kind of got into it by accident, but it was because I never, when I was a kid, I never had the thing I wanted to be or do when I grew up. But in my early 20s, when I was 21 and 26, I had two really significant deaths happen. My dad died when I was 21, and then my then boyfriend died when I was 26. And so I, at a pretty young age, just found myself kind of thrown into this experience of grief. And I couldn't find a lot of support out there. And because I was so young, most of my peers had never had such an experience. So I just, realized then, and then, as some time went by, realized that it felt to me that the amount of support and resources out there was pretty inadequate, and that I wanted to do better. I wanted to be able to um, help other people who might be grieving to have better support and more resources than was what available to me at the time.
I see. Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And one, I'd like to say I'm sorry for that being your experience, but I really admire so much that you've taken your experience and have found a way to really make it a mission to help others who really need what you needed at the time.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you. That is what I've done. I've made it my mission.
Yeah. Yeah. So, not to go back and like really fixate on it, but just to touch base because I think it's important for your story. But what were some of the key challenges in going through those experiences that that you found now that you can offer up to others in a way that's more supportive?
I think there were a lot. I mean, one challenge that I remember was just finding what felt like good support to me, whether that was professional support through therapy or other means, or whether that was support through friends or family. But in general, a lot of the support that I got felt like I was being approached as a problem that needed to be fixed. That there was something problematic or wrong with my grief. I understand that grief and death are really hard topics and make people really uncomfortable, and that oftentimes we want, as human beings, it's hard for us to see somebody in pain and somebody hurting, and we want to take that away. We want to fix it, um, but we can't, when somebody dies, we can't fix that. We can't take that pain away. And what my experience felt like being the griever was that people were trying to take my pain away. They were trying to make me happy again because that's what they wanted. But the reality was that I was grieving a loss, and that the way I was grieving and the sadness I was feeling and everything I was feeling there was nothing wrong with that. And that's what I actually did need to feel, and what I did need to go through. But again, a lot of the experience felt like people were trying to take that away from me in some way or another.
Mm. Yeah, yeah. And do you think they were trying to take that away out of an act of love and not understanding that grief is something you need to move through?
Well, an act of love in that, yeah, as we're all as being all human beings, when we see somebody who's hurting, we want to try to fix that, right? So as an act of love, I think in that sense. Um, so I don't think it was necessarily bad intention, but also in trying to take that away from somebody, we're taking away a part of their experience and a part of what they need to move through, even though it might be really hard and uncomfortable.
Sure. Yeah, and my own personal experience when I've been going through challenges, um, I've noticed for some people they're really uncomfortable with their person or that whomever that is being in a state that is less than happy,
Yeah.
less than like happy, right? It's like very triggering for other people, and they can't really hold you in that state and to accept you being there.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. Why do you think that is for people that they can't recognize that it's necessary and okay for someone to be in the trenches?
I think there can be a lot of reasons, but one is that in order for you or anybody to be able to sit with the pain or allow somebody else to sit with their pain, the person has to be okay with kind of facing their own pain, sitting with their own pain. You know, if I can't hold space for my own grief or sadness or anger or whatever it is, how can I hold space for somebody else's? I get really uncomfortable if I start to see that any of those
Yeah.
emotions coming up in somebody else. So I don't think this is the answer for all people, but I do think that for a lot of people, it becomes uncomfortable in sitting with somebody else's pain because there's something within them that's getting activated.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes perfect sense. So, what's your if what are some like best practices of sorts if for people coming to you who are going through these sudden losses and not really knowing what to do with their pain?
Mm. I think maybe one of the first things is kind of getting them to slow down and just sit with that pain, even if to start it's only for 30 seconds or a minute or something short, but just starting to be able to sit with that pain, meaning not trying to distract by getting on their phone or doing some chores around the house or calling somebody or whatever somebody might do to distract, but creating a little bit of space to be able to actually sit with that pain, and then from that getting curious about what the individual experience is, because we all have
Mhm.
our own individual experiences around it, whether that's different thoughts or different emotions or different even physical sensations that we might feel in response to um, really anything, but in this case, specifically death. Um, and so getting curious about what that experience is for us as an individual can help us to understand it better, and to therefore understand what we might need in those moments.
That's interesting. Um, and for those who are really uncomfortable, just like sitting and feeling they're the feelings, right? Or the bodily sensations or whatever might be coming up. Is there like a prompt that can be done or questions they can ask themselves that really initiates that sense of curiosity and diving a little deeper when it
Yeah.
feels so uncomfortable to do so?
Yeah. Well, and first of all, just I want to acknowledge that yes, it is so uncomfortable to do so. And we're not often like trained in doing that or really taught how to do that. So that can be one of the problems or one of the things that feels like just another layer of grief when you're just thrown into it automatically without preparing for it, usually. Um, all of a sudden, we have to be with something that we've never been trained to be with. Um, So yeah, that's very real and true that it's can be very uncomfortable and sometimes feel almost impossible for people to do that. Um, but I think maybe a starting point is just trying to clear. This is harder to do than to say, but trying to clear away any expectation. Like we're not trying to change the experience. We're not trying to make it better. We're not trying to make it worse. We're not trying to relax more. We're not trying to do anything at first. We're just trying to notice. So, just for a person, I might ask them, how long do you think you could just sit still and just notice? Maybe it's just 15 seconds, really. That's fine. But just taking that brief amount of time to start and just noticing. I might say, can you notice one thought? Can you notice one emotion? And can you notice one physical something in your body? And if you can't notice one or all of those, that's fine. But just starting with kind of taking inventory of what is accessible in that moment.
Okay. And what is the deeper meaning between noticing all three?
I don't know if I'd say it's a deeper meaning, but it's like three different languages almost. And some people are more proficient in one language than the other. So some people can, if their minds are really busy, say like there's a lot of racing thoughts, it might be pretty easy to be like, oh yeah, there's a thought, but they might be a bit more disconnected from their body, so they might not be able to notice, and maybe they don't think they feel anything physically, or they may not be able to name an emotion. So naming the thought might be relatively easy, but anything else might not be accessible right now. So it's just giving a few different options for people depending on kind of what language they speak.
Yeah, I think that's so beautiful and I love it. For me, it sounds like attunement. Like I'm attuning to all three
Mhm.
languages. And if I can get connected with all three of them, and then I'm proficient in speaking all of these languages, I can really bring them together to have this full, well rounded experience that is telling me what is happening and surrendering more so into
Yeah.
all of those. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's maybe the longer term direction we're trying to go in, and getting like to be in the place of being attuned with all of those, but not everybody starts off there. So sometimes it
Yeah.
takes a little
Yeah.
bit of practice.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, I would say from my own personal journey is absolutely taken a lot of practice to slow down
Yeah.
and ask myself specifically, what is my body telling me?
Yeah.
Because, pushing, I've always been like pushed through or like thought through things or had emotions that were intellectualized, right? But I never really thought about how is my body feeling right
Hmm.
now. And that's become like such a beautiful, and I love that you use the word, call them languages, right? It's a very loud language once
Yeah.
you like move out of disassociation and pay attention. And that's
Yeah.
for me, like all the healing. I'm like, oh, there's a block here. Oh, what is this block telling me, right?
Mhm.
And I've been so blessed in my life not to have that many like sudden losses as far as death, but there's other ways that grief has shown up. And I've realized that many times my grief is buried beneath many other emotions, and the deep feeling is grief. And I'm wondering for your coaching clients and your therapy clients, um, is that common for grief to be buried?
Hmm. Yeah. And I also think of grief as kind of a big ball of a lot of different emotional experiences. So the grief can be um, it can be maybe hard to define as just one thing, and so it can be an experience of a lot of emotional things. But yes, it can also be buried, so to speak, in that um, it's not something again that we're usually very comfortable with or like really trained um, in what to do with it. So when it arises, it can be something that we sort of um, whether we're aware we're doing it or not, just dismiss it or kind of push it away, so that it does kind of get buried in a sense.
Mm-hmm. Well, if you had a magic wand and you could get everybody trained in how to deal and process in a more efficient, effective, holistic way, what would you do with your wand?
Well, I've kind of thought about this before. I think, it might start with just general emotional awareness with kids. I think it'd be great if this was with kids in school, something that they were taught a little bit more, in how to identify in themselves what emotions they're feeling, and then kind of what to do with those emotions, or the physical um, responses that might correlate with the emotions, what to do with those things in a way that's healthy and not going to hurt themselves or hurt somebody else. Because that starts to train us as people from a young age just to speak that language again, so to speak, and have that awareness of ourselves, and then have some tools available to us to know what to do when we're feeling certain things. So I think, as it relates to grief and otherwise, like that could be a great foundational place for humans.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And I'm curious if you've done any like research on other cultures and how they process loss.
Mm-hmm.
Because I have not really, but I've gotten the honor of traveling around the world a bit and been exposed to a few things. And it just seems like some cultures may do it a little bit better.
Mm-hmm.
Am I wrong? I don't know.
Yeah. Well, I would say cultures do it differently. Better, whether you label that better or worse, I think depends on the perspective you're coming
Yeah.
from, what your history is. Um, but definitely cultures do it differently. I wouldn't say I've done a lot of research on it per se, but I've worked with people coming from different cultures, and I'd like to think at least that I hold the space for them being able to teach me something. I can't be an expert on all the cultures out there, but them to be able to teach me a little bit of what their culture has taught them and what it relates to, or how it relates to death and grief, and what's important to them and why. I remember working with a Native American woman once who, within their culture, um, they're not supposed to speak of the dead after they've died, because they believe that speaking of them or saying their name keeps them kind of in this world, in this physical world. When once they've died, they're supposed to go on to whatever the belief is, they go where they go afterwards. And if you talk about them, that keeps them kind of stuck in this world. So that's the belief. So that would, um, that if you're going to therapy, or doing whatever it is you might be doing, where somebody's encouraging you to talk about your person, then obviously those two um, belief systems can collide there. So yeah, I do think it is important just to kind of consider that and allow for those different cultural beliefs to be true for that person.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's such a fascinating concept that they I fully respect it, and simultaneously I'm like, I would imagine for the griever that would be very challenging,
Mm-hmm.
right? To instantly cut yourself off from speaking of that person, to just because culturally for me, like I love remembering people and going into that space and sharing. Um, so it's really fascinating to hear
Mm-hmm.
that. And I don't know if you can and speak of that challenge, but how would you navigate that as a griever in a way that is both honoring to the culture, simultaneously allowing you to process how you need.
Well, I do think that example I gave is just kind of like a very small slice of probably a bigger picture, because within, and I'm not familiar with that culture enough to be able to speak to it in a way I feel confident about, but I'm going to make an assumption that within the culture there are other rituals or rites of passage or whatever that are also tied into the process of death, um, and um, the initial like memorialization of the person and whatever goes beyond that. That would, I think the intention behind those would be to create some sort of um, I don't know if I love the word closure here, but some sort of closure or preparation for the next thing to come, and whatever that means for that culture. So I don't think, it's just one rule, never talk about them again, and that's it. Like, I think there's a lot more context that goes into that, with the intention of creating like a whole system of grief as it makes sense to that culture, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. That makes perfect sense. And I'm curious if you could go back in time and give a younger you some words of wisdom that might pertain to your particular journey in this space, what would you say, and to what age would you go back to?
That is a good one. I think I would maybe go back to my early 20s, around the time that my world was really kind of rocked with these deaths, and acknowledge to my younger self that you are about to go through a lot. It's going to be hard, um, but you will. Things. What do I want to say? Things will not always feel as hard as they are right now.
Mm,
There will be another side to this.
mm, yeah. Yeah, I think that's really beautiful. Hmm. Um, for those around, you'd mentioned it's your father and then your boyfriend. Um, for those who are in similar situations, I would say, who are the support system, I would say specifically, like you're a younger woman person who has lost your partner. Um, what's some encouragement or advice for those who are in the support system, that how they can better show up for that person who's grieving?
Yeah, I love I love this question. I love kind of considering through the lens of the support system, but and there's a lot of answers to that question. But if I had to narrow it down to one thing, I might say try to listen to them, to the person who's grieving, and hear what it is that they are saying that they need or what they want, as opposed to putting your own stuff on them or giving them what you think is right or what you think is the best advice. Try to listen to them
Mm-hmm.
instead of um, giving them what you think is right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that. I think one of the biggest lessons for me in the last several years has been just to ask people when they're going through things, how can I support you?
Mm-hmm.
Is there anything that you need?
Yeah.
Right. And I found that a lot of times people do know what they need. And even just yesterday, a friend had reached out and was grieving some heartbreak. And I asked that question, and it was a really simple answer. But what I thought this person needed was more,
Yeah.
right? Like
Yeah.
actual physical support. Like, I'll come over, we'll hang out, da 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 da. And I'll just be there. You don't have to talk. I'll just be there with you. But the answer was like, I just needed to know that there's someone here for me, and that I'm loved. That's
Yeah.
all I needed to know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, totally, and that's
Mhm.
often the case is what the person actually needs is so much more simple than what we might than the story we might create about, "Whoa, I need to do all of these things," and that's usually not the case. They just need to know somebody loves them and cares and isn't trying to kind of circling back to what I said at the beginning, but isn't trying to take away their pain.
Yeah. 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 I know you'd mentioned, for those who are going through the grieving process, the practice of just how long can you just sit with yourself and touch in with these different languages. So once a person is able to do that, I imagine then that some emotion is evoked and there might be some unlocking that's happening. And I'm curious, like, what's the next step in that process? Like, and to that question, actually, is there actually like a relatively formulaic way in which people move through grief?
Mhm. Yeah. I'll answer the second part of that first with no, there's not. Um, we like to think that or, hope for that because that makes it like simpler in a way. Like we know, like if I just do A, B, and C, then I'm
Yeah.
done and it's over and I finish grief. But unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, depending on your perspective, I guess that's not the way it works. It's different for everybody. It's different for every relationship lost. It's different even if you have multiple deaths. Your grief will be different for each one. Um, so there is no right or wrong way to do it. Um, and then to come back to the first part of the question is once we can start to slow down maybe just a touch and start to read into ourselves and see what or how we are in this moment. I think of it just kind of as getting really curious about our grief and getting to know our grief. I mean, you often hear that the term, move on from our grief, like, but when do we move on or how do we move on? Instead of that, I prefer and I feel is more accurate the getting to know our grief and then integrating that, figuring out how to integrate that into our lives. Because once we can start to sit for little bits of time with our pain, with our sadness, with our grief, then we start to recognize what it is for us, how it shows up in our bodies, and also how it can be different from day to day or week to week or year to year, whatever it is. And from there, that can help to dictate or help us to better understand, I suppose, what we need for ourselves, how we need to take care of ourselves and take care of that grief.
Mm-hmm. Whew. Yeah, I think those are really beautiful answers. And you touched on like the moving on, right? Moving on, moving on, moving on. It seems like there's a lot of rushing to
Yeah,
move on, to just aren't like I've heard it from other people. Oh, shouldn't you be over that by
yeah,
now?
yeah.
Right. And I think that's almost like a shaming
Hmm.
component, right? And then it's like, oh, well, I guess I can't talk about this anymore because I should be over it. And that people don't want to hear this anymore, or like they want to see me happy again. Right. But I'm truly not. Right. So let me put this mask on.
Yeah, yeah. It does feel shameful, and it can feel like, or it can come with a suggestion of like you're somehow doing it wrong if you're not over it by the
Mhm.
time that this other person says you should be over it. That, oh, I must be doing it wrong. um, and all that really does is teaches the person who's grieving that the person who's asking them when they're going to be over it isn't a safe person to kind of be honest with, to share their real experience with, because they're trying to um, put a timeline on it or rush them through that pain. Um,
Yeah.
yeah. So we have this weird, strange idea, though, that like there's some magic number of this timeline within who knows what it is, however many days, weeks, years, whatever, that we should be um, done grieving by now. But
Mm-hmm.
that's just a totally arbitrary number that someone decided was the right number, but isn't.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful. So, what are some ways in which people can, you've kind of touched on like how to be more integrated and attuned, but how can they use their grief as a way to discover purpose and some resilience, or something that is a bit more empowering as they step forward and process their grief?
Yeah. Well, I think once you get to know what your grief experience is, you can better know what you want to do with that. Like, I mean, for me, my grief experience was very lonely, um, for a lot of reasons. Some I kind of touched on earlier, but mine was very lonely, and so for me, being that the reality is we are all going to die. So the reality is we're all going to experience grief at some point. For me, that loneliness, the fact that I had to go through it in a way that felt really lonely seemed kind of stupid to me because it's not, I mean, it's really a universal experience, but I had to go through it totally alone. So for me, that understanding that loneliness part of my grief and being able to see it and name it as such, um, I think was the one of the big drivers for me to go to grad school, build the business, and do all of the things that I've done thus far to try to make it less of a lonely experience for other people. And that's obviously going to be different for everybody. Everybody's going to do something different with that grief. And it may be bigger than what I've done, or it may be much less. Like, it doesn't mean you necessarily have to like build a whole thing out of your grief, but understanding what your grief is and what that means to you is going to kind of lay the crumbs for the pathway of where that leads you, what you do with that grief from there.
Sure. Yeah, I think there's a lot of spiritual components that can come into these spaces and places of pain. And again, referencing my own journey, in the depths of my pain, I have found deeper purpose, so much more connection with
Yeah.
myself, and because I was in a way forced to be still, was able to hear what I define as like divine love, God, whatever, speaking to me, my higher self. And before, there was just too much other distraction going on. And I'm curious if you've noticed that as a pattern in yourself and with others that you work with.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. Yes, I'll speak for myself first, but just, yeah, notice that when there's a lot more busyness going on,
Mm,
whether that's things I, do to fill up my life, or even just like the mental busyness, the chatter there, um, it's much more difficult. Sometimes feels even impossible to connect with myself, right? To know what I need in any given moment. Um, and I think, yeah, that's with many people I've worked with too. That can be really true for others. It's hard to know. Well, I think of that as being in like that constant busyness as almost an experience of being in the fight or flight mode, when we're just like kind of always looking, scanning our environment for the danger, the thing that we perceive at least is going to hurt us. So when you're always looking for danger, um, when your brain is in the place where it believes it needs to be scanning always for danger, then that's not the time for your body
mhm,
to be, having deep contemplation or, slowing down or sitting down, because your body really believes there's a threat. So what your body thinks it needs to do then is run, or fight or freeze.
mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, so beautifully said. Absolutely. Well, in your time since, making these shifts and creating space for others, have you noticed um, newer ways or greater opportunities for grief support for people that just weren't available back years ago?
Yeah, for sure. So my experiences were in 2001 and 2007.
Mm,
So since then, yes, I have noticed that there's a lot more support that exists out there through podcasts, through online support, through on social media. I see a lot of other like grief coaches or grief support groups or books. There's a lot more that's been created around the support of grief than existed 20 some years ago. And so I think that's a great thing. But
mhm.
I do still think it's not to the place where it should be and could be.
Yeah, 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 of course. Well, I would love to open up the floor for anything that you would like to share that we haven't touched on before we close out.
Okay. Um, what do I want to share? Well, um, I have a lot of information and resources available online on my website and on Instagram handle. Is it okay if I share those?
Absolutely,
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay. So the website is withlovelew.com, and Lew is spelled Lew. So withlovelew.com. And then the Instagram is with underscore Loveloo. Again, Lew. But those are places, yeah, where I share all kinds of some personal information, or resources, connection, different ways that we can support ourselves and support others in grief.
Absolutely. Well, I super appreciate you coming on the show today and talking about this extremely important topic that, as you said, impacts all of us. And yeah, the wisdom that you've gleaned today has been so beautiful. And I just want to encourage everyone to check out your resources. And yeah, Laura, it's been such an honor. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. And yeah, everyone, you can check out the show notes. And I just encourage you to share this beautiful episode with others and heed the advice that sometimes less is more when supporting those that we love in our life who are going through some challenging times. And as always, I invite you to leave a review. And until next time, thanks, everyone.